There is a stretch of border between the United States and Canada that runs nearly 4,000 miles. It is the longest undefended border in the world. For generations, it stood as proof that two countries could share a continent without sharing hostility. Goods flowed freely. Energy crossed without tariffs. Factories on both sides of that line were built with the assumption that what was made here would sell there. That assumption held for decades. It shaped entire cities. It employed millions of people. It was so reliable that most Americans never gave it a second thought. That assumption is now in pieces. What has happened between Washington and Ottawa over the past 14 months is not a trade dispute in the conventional sense. It is a fundamental rupture in one of the most economically intertwined relationships in the history of the modern world. And as of this week in March 2026, the story has reached a turning point that few people anticipated. Canada has not capitulated. Canada has not broken. Canada has, in fact, forced the President of the United States to respond legally, diplomatically, and economically in ways that have stunned officials inside Washington and rattled markets from New York to Tokyo. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the tariffs themselves, but to the logic behind them. Part 1, the opening shot. On February 1st, 2025, President Donald Trump signed 3 executive orders that changed the economic relationship between the United States and its 2 closest neighbors. He imposed a 25% tariff on most goods coming in from Canada. He imposed the same on Mexico. He imposed 10% on China. The legal authority he cited was something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA for short, a law passed in 1977 that gives presidents extraordinary powers during national emergencies. Trump declared the emergency to be the flow of fentanyl across American borders. The numbers on fentanyl from Canada did not support the framing. According to U.S. Customs and Border Protection data reviewed at the time, in the entire 2024 fiscal year, agents seized 43 pounds of fentanyl at the Canadian border. At the Mexican border, that number was 21,100 pounds. Canada accounted for less than 1% of all fentanyl seized by American border agents. The math did not add up, but the executive order stood. Canada's initial response came within days. The Canadian government announced retaliatory tariffs on 30 billion Canadian dollars worth of American goods. That was just the opening move. Within 3 weeks, that number escalated to $155 billion. American oranges, American alcohol, American clothing, American motorcycles. Goods from 36 U.S. states that rely on Canada as their top export destination. The Royal Bank of Canada's chief economists called the blanket tariffs on Canadian imports the country's largest trade shock in nearly 100 years, comparable, they said, to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930, which many historians cite as a key accelerant of the Great Depression. Canada and the United States trade roughly $700 billion in goods and services every year. Nearly $3.5 billion Canadian dollars worth of goods and services cross the border every single day. About 60% of America's crude oil imports come from Canada. 85% of U.S. electricity imports come from Canada. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium to the United States. Canada is also the top export destination for 36 individual U.S. states, more than the United Kingdom, France, China, and Japan combined. This is not a trade relationship between equals in size, but it is a trade relationship of profound interdependence. And that interdependence is the key to understanding everything that came next. Part 2, the man Canada sent into the fight. Justin Trudeau resigned in January 2025. His departure was driven by domestic political collapse, not just the trade war. But the timing mattered. Canada needed a new leader at the moment when the country was under the most severe external economic pressure in a century. What Canada got was Mark Carney. Carney is not a career politician. He is a former central banker who ran both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He speaks the language of financial markets fluently. He understands the mechanics of currency pressure, interest rate cycles, and trade imbalances from the inside. When Carney stood before a crowd in March 2025 and delivered his victory speech as the new leader of the Liberal Party, he did not offer soothing platitudes. He issued a warning. "We didn't ask for this fight," he said, "but Canadians are always ready when someone else drops the gloves. So the Americans, they should make no mistake in trade, as in hockey, Canada will win." It was the kind of line that plays well to a domestic audience. But Carney backed it up with something more consequential than rhetoric. He backed it up with strategy. First, he committed to keeping Canada's retaliatory tariffs in place until the United States showed, in his words, respect and made credible, reliable commitments to free and fair trade. Every dollar collected from those retaliatory measures, he pledged, would go directly to supporting Canadian workers and businesses hurt by American tariffs. It was a political and economic circuit breaker, a way of recycling the pain of the trade war back into the system as a form of solidarity. Second, and more quietly, he began the work of moving Canada's economic relationships away from their exclusive dependence on the United States. He traveled to India, to Japan, to Australia. He went to Beijing. In January 2026, during a visit to China, he struck a deal that lowered tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for reduced Chinese import taxes on Canadian agricultural products, canola oil, seafood, pork, farm goods that had been locked out of Chinese markets for years. The deal was calibrated, limited, and not without its critics inside Canada. But it sent a message to Washington that Carney intended the world to hear. Canada was no longer waiting by the phone. Part 3. Trump's escalations and the January threat. President Trump's response to the China-Canada deal was immediate and volcanic. On January 24, 2026, Trump posted on Truth Social that if Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, whom he had taken to calling Governor Carney a deliberate provocation, thought he was going to make Canada a drop-off port for China to send goods into the United States, he was, in Trump's words, sorely mistaken. Trump threatened to impose a 100% tariff on all Canadian imports if Canada went through with the China deal. The threat was existential in scale. Analysts estimated that a 100% tariff on all Canadian imports could raise U.S. inflation by 1.5% to 2% almost immediately. Energy prices would spike. Auto prices would surge. The integrated North American supply chains that American manufacturers had spent decades building would be severed overnight. Carney's response was measured. He clarified that Canada had no intention of pursuing a full free trade agreement with China, only a targeted deal on specific goods. He noted that the arrangement was entirely consistent with the terms of the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, known in Canada as CUSMA and in the United States as USMCA. He noted that Canada accounted for only 1% of fentanyl entering the United States. He noted that Canada was making historic investments in border security. And then something unusual happened. Trump, who had initiated the threat, partially walked it back. He had initially said, in different comments, that Canada signing a deal with China was actually what he should be doing, and that it's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. The contradiction sat unresolved. The 100% tariff was never imposed. But something more significant was already building in the American legal system. And it was about to reshape the entire battlefield. Part 4. The Supreme Court strikes on the morning of February 20th, 2026. The Supreme Court of the United States issued one of the most consequential trade rulings in American history. In a 6-3 decision in the case known as Learning Resources Incorporated versus Trump, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote for the majority, "The International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not authorize the president to impose tariffs." The ruling was not subtle. Roberts wrote that the government's reading of IEPA would give the president power to unilaterally impose what he called unbounded tariffs, unconstrained by the significant procedural limitations in other tariff statutes and free to issue. His words, a dizzying array of modifications at will, as long as he declares an emergency. That interpretation, Roberts concluded, would represent a transformative expansion of the president's authority. The Constitution, he reminded the nation, places the power to tax with Congress, not the executive branch. The ruling wiped out the legal foundation for tariffs Trump had imposed on Canada, Mexico, China, and a long list of other trading partners going back to what the administration had called Liberation Day in April 2025, when sweeping reciprocal tariffs on nearly every country on Earth had been announced. The tax foundation estimated that more than $160 billion in IEEPA tariffs had been collected up to the day of the ruling, tariffs it now described as illegally collected. J.P. Morgan had estimated the IEEPA measures alone accounted for roughly 61% of the year-to-date increase in U.S. tariffs, or about $180 billion on an annualized basis. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, writing in dissent, warned of turbulence. He noted the federal government might be required to refund billions of dollars to importers who had paid those tariffs, even in cases where the importers had already passed the costs on to consumers. He warned that trade deals, some worth trillions of dollars, including agreements with China, the United Kingdom, and Japan, could face new legal uncertainty. That process, too, could be difficult, he wrote. The 6 justices in the majority did not address refunds. They left that to the lower courts to sort out, a process that trade lawyers say will be extraordinarily complex and is likely to take years. Within hours of the ruling, the market reacted. The S&P 500 moved. Currency markets shifted. And in Washington, the White House held a press conference. Part 5. The administration's pivot the president did not accept the Supreme Court's ruling as a limit on his ambitions. He accepted it as an inconvenience that required a workaround. Standing before reporters on the afternoon of February 20th, Trump announced that he would immediately impose a new 10% global tariff under a different legal authority, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. The next morning, he announced on Truth Social that he was raising that figure to 15%, the maximum allowed under Section 122. Section 122 had not been used to impose tariffs by any president since it was written in 1974. It authorizes the president to impose a temporary import surcharge of up to 15% for up to 150 days to address what it describes as large and serious United States balance of payments deficits. After 150 days, Congress must vote to continue the tariffs, otherwise they expire automatically. Legal scholars raised immediate questions. The statute applies specifically to balance of payments deficits, a precise technical concept in international economics. It is not the same thing as a trade deficit, which is what the Trump administration had been citing as its grievance. The Peterson Institute for International Economics wrote that Section 122 does not appear to apply to the current U.S. international payments position. The administration's own lawyers had argued before the Supreme Court that Section 122 was not a substitute for IEEPA, precisely because balance of payment deficits are conceptually distinct from the trade deficits Trump had characterized as an emergency. But Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent offered a reassurance that told the real story of what the administration intended. Combining Section 122, Section 232, and Section 301 tariffs, he stated, will result in virtually unchanged tariff revenue in 2026. This was the administration's signal that it intended to replace the illegal tariffs with enough legal ones to produce the same economic outcome, regardless of the legal theories involved. Meanwhile, the Section 122 tariffs had an important carve-out for Canada. Goods that comply with the USMCA, the trade deal negotiated during Trump's first term and still in force, are exempt from the new 15% surcharge. That means roughly 90% of the value of Canadian exports to the United States remain free of this particular tariff. Canada's average tariff rate from the United States, even after more than a year of trade war, remains among the lowest of any of America's trading partners, around 5.5% overall. This is the paradox at the heart of the story. Canada has been fighting the most visible and politically charged trade war with the United States. And yet the structure of the USMCA has kept Canada insulated from some of the worst of what Trump has been able to legally do. Which brings us to the most dangerous part of this story. The USMCA expires for review in the summer of 2026. Part 6. The Renegotiation Trap. The Canada-US-Mexico Agreement was Trump's deal, He negotiated it during his first term to replace NAFTA, and he championed it as proof that he could deliver better outcomes than his predecessors. Now he is using it as leverage in a way its architects may not have fully anticipated. The U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer told a Canadian broadcaster in February 2026 that any trade deal with Canada will include tariffs. He was explicit. The United States wants greater access to Canada's dairy market. It wants changes to rules requiring U.S. streaming platforms operating in Canada to fund Canadian content and run Canadian programming. It wants tougher rules of origin in strategic sectors, including defense, mining, advanced manufacturing, steel, and aluminum. Canada, for its part, wants the punishing sector-specific tariffs, 50% on steel and aluminum, tariffs on autos, tariffs on softwood lumber, removed or substantially reduced. Canada wants certainty. Canadian businesses need to know what the rules will be, not just this quarter, but for years ahead. Every month of uncertainty is a month during which investment decisions are deferred, supply chains are rerouted, and factories consider moving. The maddening dynamic, as one Canada-US trade expert put it, is that Trump does not like Canada's tough, detail-oriented approach to trade negotiations. Canada brings lawyers and economists and technical experts to the table. Trump tends to respond to gestures, to optics, to deals he can announce as wins. Closing the gap between those two styles of negotiation while billions of dollars in tariffs continue to distort both economies is the diplomatic challenge of the moment. Talks had been called off entirely in October 2025 after the province of Ontario aired a television advertisement during U.S. broadcasts that used audio clips of the late President Ronald Reagan warning against tariffs. Trump was reportedly furious. He announced that all trade negotiations with Canada were canceled. He said he would raise tariffs by an additional 10%. He did not follow through on the 10% increase, but the talks stayed frozen for months. Then, on March 6, 2026, just weeks ago, Canadian Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc flew to Washington to meet with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer face-to-face, the first such meeting since Trump had called off the talks. Trade analysts in both countries called it a significant and positive sign. The symbolic importance of the two men sitting across the table from each other was real. But the structural problems have not gone anywhere. Part 7. What Canada has done to itself and to the relationship. There is a version of this story where Canada is a victim, a smaller economy absorbing punishment from a larger, more powerful neighbor with an unpredictable president. That version is true, but it is incomplete. What Carney and his government have also done, in ways that will have lasting economic consequences, is accelerate a strategic decoupling from the United States that may prove irreversible regardless of how the current tariff fight ends. The data tells the story with uncomfortable clarity. According to Global Affairs Canada, in December 2025, Canada's annual goods exports to the United States fell by 5.5%. But goods exports to non-US markets rose by 17% in the same period. The U.S. share of Canadian goods exports fell 4 percentage points in 2025 compared to 2024 to 71.5%. That is the lowest share of Canadian exports going to the United States since the early 1980s, before the two countries had a free trade agreement at all. Canadian auto production dropped by 5.5% in 2025. It is expected to continue declining in 2026. Carney has secured a $2.5 billion uranium supply deal with India. He has launched trade talks with Australia and Japan. He has, deliberately and publicly, built a foreign policy argument that the era of deep, unquestioned economic integration with the United States is over. In March 2025, standing before a crowd after Trump's auto tariffs were announced, Carney delivered a sentence that has since been quoted in parliaments and boardrooms across the world. The era of close economic integration and security cooperation with the United States has ended, he said. Our strategy involves combating these tariffs, safeguarding Canadian interests, and strengthening domestic industries. We will implement retaliatory trade measures designed to maximize U.S. consequences while minimizing domestic fallout. Then he said something even more pointed. The 80-year period when the United States embraced the mantle of global economic leadership, when it forged alliances rooted in trust and mutual respect, and championed the free and open exchange of goods and services, is over. That was not a diplomatic talking point. That was a eulogy. At Davos in January 2026, Kearney stood on the world stage and said, "Middle powers must act together, because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu." Trump, attending Davos at the same time, answered publicly, "Canada lives because of the United States." Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements. Trump then revoked his invitation for Kearney to join his newly formed Board of Peace, and posted an altered image on Truth Social showing a map of the United States that included Canada, Venezuela, Greenland, and Cuba inside American territory. The image was the kind of provocation designed to be dismissed as a joke, but landed as something harder to laugh off in Ottawa. Part 8. What American consumers are actually paying the story of the Canada-US trade war is often told in terms of geopolitics and presidential posturing. But there is another story, the one happening at the grocery store, the car dealership, and the gas pump. According to the Tax Foundation, the Trump tariffs as a whole represent the largest U.S. tax increase as a percent of GDP since 1993. They amount to an average tax increase per American household of $1,500 in 2026. That is not a number from a Canadian think tank. That is from an American economic research organization based in Washington. Morningstar, the financial research firm, projects that U.S. inflation will rise to 2.7% in 2026 as businesses begin to pass tariff costs through to consumers after absorbing them for most of the previous year. The businesses that had been stockpiling pre-tariff inventory are now running out. The inventories that had been purchased before the tariffs kicked in are depleted. Price increases that had been delayed are now arriving. JP Morgan's chief global economist warned of a large sentiment shock hitting the business sector. Goldman Sachs projected that the current tariff regime will raise inflation by 1 full percentage point between the second half of 2025 and the first half of 2026. Economists at the Peterson Institute for International Economics put the risk even higher, arguing that inflation could exceed 4% by the end of 2026, more than double the Federal Reserve's 2% target. The drivers they cite are layered: the delayed pass-through of tariffs to consumer prices, tighter labor supply from reduced immigration, a looser fiscal policy that is already adding stimulus to an economy running above capacity. The Federal Reserve finds itself in an uncomfortable position. If it raises interest rates aggressively to fight tariff-driven inflation, it risks tipping the labor market into a recession. If it holds rates or cuts them to support growth, it risks letting inflation run. Stanford economists writing for the university's Economic Policy Institute described the risk as stagflation, the rare and particularly punishing combination of high inflation and high unemployment that plagued the American economy in the 1970s. Once it starts, they wrote, stagflation can be hard to reverse.